All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Dunk on AP podcast. Today, we're going to be dunking on APUSH and talking about the original 13 colonies where America gets its start. So, remember that the original 13 colonies, starting with Jamestown, which would become Virginia in 1607, and ending with Georgia in 1733. So, you're going to get a total of 13 distinct colonies developed along the Atlantic coast in America's beginning. Each of these 13 colonies were allowed to exist because of a charter of some sort from England. Some colonies were made for religious purposes and some were for financial gain. Now, the colonial regions, these are just about as important, maybe more important to know than the individual colonies. You need to know the regions. So, first of all, you've got New England. These were Puritan settlements. They were settled by families, longer life expectancy in New England, better climate, less disease, merchants and artisans, and subsistence farming up there because the growing season isn't as long. The middle colonies, known as the breadbasket of the 13 colonies, but also trade in cities like New York and Philadelphia. Then you've got the Chesapeake region, which is the top of the southern colonies. This is Virginia and Maryland. They were tobacco farming, but also trade on the coast. Then you've got the southern colonies, which were more plant-based, labor-intensive staple crops like rice, indigo, cotton. And then you had a small number of elite plantation owners. The majority were small farm owners, though, in the southern colonies. Three types of charters existed to allow a colony to exist. Corporate colonies like Jamestown, Virginia. This was operated by a joint stock company who stood to gain money from the riches gained during the venture. Then you had royal colonies like Virginia after 1624, which was under direct authority of the king's government. That's what happens whenever your colony almost dies. Then the proprietary colonies like Maryland and Pennsylvania, they're under the authority of individuals who've been granted charters of ownership by the king. So how did it all begin? So England had a growing population and a struggling economy. You had a lot of poor and landless people that were prevalent all over England, and the colonies represented a new opportunity to either move or to invest your money. And so you had joint stock companies. This was a business entity in which shares of the company's stock can be bought and sold by shareholders. Each shareholder owns company stock in proportion evidenced by their shares. So you make an investment and you get back money proportional to what you invested. So first up, let's talk Jamestown, led by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company. This was meant to be a permanent settlement that would make money, but life was insanely difficult for settlers. They didn't know how to farm and they weren't accustomed to the terrain or the climate. Disease and starvation were everywhere. They relied very heavily on the natives, but relations weren't always great. John Smith kept the colony afloat through forceful leadership, like very forceful leadership. John Rolfe and his native wife developed the tobacco crop. His native wife, Pocahontas, developed the tobacco crop that would make Virginia extremely profitable. Now, like I said, life in Jamestown was very rough. They had to resort to eating dogs, cats, rats, mice. There's brutal stories about them surviving. Only 60 survived the winter of 1609 to 1610. They governed themselves via the House of Burgesses within their first 12 years. This was the first elected General Assembly in the colonies, and it paved the way for the democratic society formed during the Revolution. As with other colonies, only male landowners could vote, and they had few rights, and this was the same with slaves. And so most colonial governors ruled with basically unlimited powers, answering only to the king. So there's a little bit of voting here, but don't think of it as the modern way that we vote, where you have a lot of say. Sometimes the Jamestown settlers get along with natives. When Jamestown settlers were starving, they would raid Powhatan native food supply. Natives in turn raided the camps and killed lots of settlers. This led to the First Anglo-Powhatan War in 1614, which ended with the marriage of Pocahontas to the colonist John Rolfe. 8 years later, the Second Anglo-Powhatan War took place because of a massive native raid on Jamestown. The dates on this are sort of sketchy, but this war lasted in some form for the next 20 or so years. A peace treaty was signed in 1646. By 1669, only 2,000 natives are going to remain in Virginia. So by 1610, 7 out of every 8 Jamestown settlers die because life there is so difficult. Then by 1624, original Jamestown is completely toast. The colony was heavily in debt despite tobacco production. King James I revoked the colony's charter and took direct control of the colony, making it the first royal colony. Jamestown was henceforth known as Virginia from that time. So slavery, we're getting there. That's coming up. The original laborers in America were white indentured servants. They worked for a few years and then they gained their freedom. African slaves are going to show up on the scene later in 1619, but won't become really plentiful until the late 1600s. The big discovery, though, from Jamestown is that tobacco grows extremely well here. Okay. Um, it's very, very important to note also, as Virginia expands west and as indentured servants become more and more free, it leads to issues in competition with the natives. By 1676, Virginians were asking Britain and the local governor there, for help in the fight. When Britain didn't send help, it led to Bacon's Rebellion. This was an uprising in 1676 to 1677 against American Indians and the colonial government in the Virginia colony, overtaking reprisal action for alleged thefts by Native Americans. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy 29-year-old planter in opposition to the governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley. Bacon's rebellion was the first rebellion in the American colonies, and it leads to the British government saying, hey, we need to stop with all this indentured servitude stuff. It's going to be better if we just import African slaves. So moving on to Virginia. So now that King Charles I had a heavier hand on Virginia, he divided it into a second colony, Maryland, in 1632. Control of Maryland was given to Cecil Calvert, aka Lord Baltimore. He died before the venture really got started and was replaced by his son, who has the same name and title. It was founded for religious liberty for Catholics, also tobacco. Pretty big problem, though. Maryland was already settled, mostly by Protestants. They did not like having a Catholic governor. Catholics faced resentful neighbors when they settled. This was the third colony after Virginia and Massachusetts. It also is going to help lead to America's first Religious Freedom Act, the Act of Toleration, which was the first colonial statute granting religious freedom to all Christians. Not a total religious liberty law, though anyone who denied the divinity of Jesus could be killed. So not religious tolerance the way that we might see it now. Virginia and Maryland created the Chesapeake colonies, and really those were the biggest parts of the southern colonies. Now let's move to the New England colonies. So Plymouth colony is going to be the one that really starts there. This was radical dissenters to the Church of England. They wanted to organize a separate church independent of royal control. First, they went to Holland, but that didn't work out. So they set out for the New World in 1620, and that's going to be the game that we play, the AP Adventure game. That is what this is. So the Plymouth colony, along with the Massachusetts Bay colony, was made up of Puritans who bought in 100% to the Protestant Reformation. They believed in Calvinism, the Protestant theological system of John Calvin and his successors, which develops Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone and emphasizes the grace of God and the doctrine of predestination. So Calvinism argued that God was all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing. Because God is all-knowing, he has predetermined who will go to heaven or hell. This is what the Calvinists believed. But the elect, those chosen for heaven, could not count on their salvation by leading ungodly lives. Salvation could not be known for sure, so signs were looked for constantly. This was the belief system of the separatists. King Henry was not a fan of theirs, and they were not a fan of his. So Massachusetts Bay Colony will come 10 years later in 1630. These were more moderate Puritans who believed that the Church of England could be reformed. They were known as Puritans for wanting to purify the church. They were non-separatists. Led by Governor John Winthrop, around 1,000 settlers came to Massachusetts Bay. This was a big settlement, and a civil war in England sent thousands more within a few years. Massachusetts Bay was extremely successful, and we shall be on as a city on a hill, taken from Scripture, was their sort of driving mission. Now, Anne Hutchinson. Remember, AP is always interested in how these events they affect groups like Africans or women. So an important woman to know for the Plymouth colony is Anne Hutchinson. She was I said the Plymouth colony. I'm sorry, I meant the Massachusetts Bay colony. Anne Hutchinson was a spiritual leader in colonial Massachusetts who challenged male authority by preaching to both women and men and questioning Puritan teachings about salvation. So their government in the New England colonies traditionally, free men, aka male church members, could vote, but this was not much of a democracy. Laws were strict in order to keep people from sinning. Punishment for breaking the law often resulted in death, banishment, or floggings. Life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was tough, but because of its more connected society and large numbers, it was ultimately successful. Rhode Island, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. In 1636, Rhode Island became a colony after Roger Williams, a clergyman, obtained a charter from England to form the colony. He spoke out against the Puritan strictness and went to this area to settle and provide religious choice. Rhode Island also had freedom of religion. Again, that's kind of a relative term in this time. Uh, this is a New England colony. Then you've got Connecticut, also founded in 1636 by a clergyman by the then name of Thomas Hooker. He led a group of people from Rhode Island to start their own colony, and they had relative freedom of religion. This is a New England colony. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. This was the first written constitution in the American colonies, and the Charter of 1662 represent Connecticut's earliest efforts to establish a representative form of government. New Hampshire was sold to the King of England in 1679. The royal colony, it was a royal colony in which the king chooses a governor and there was no elected government. So, the New England Confederation, you've got a problem with natives posing a constant threat to New England colonies. Settlers could expect no help from home, from Britain, meaning, because of a civil war going on there. In 1643, in Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Connecticut, and New Haven, they formed a military alliance known as the New England Confederation. It had limited powers to deal with boundary disputes, the return of runaway servants, and dealings with American Indians. The alliance ended in 1684 when Britain started paying more attention to the island, but this was the first step in the colonists banding together toward a common cause. The New England Confederation's most major confrontation was a year-long war against the Wampanoag Indians and their leader, Metacom. The colonists knew him as King Philip. Metacom gathered other tribes to attack the English settlers for constant encroachment on native land. 3,000 natives die in this war and 1,000 colonists die in this war. The war ends in Metacom's, or King Philip's, death. About half of New England settlements were attacked and many towns and villages were burned down. Colonial forces prevail after a bloody year. Now, the middle colonies. The middle colonies had a lot of fertile soil, which allowed them to be major exporters of wheat and other grains. The lumber and shipbuilding industries were also successful in the middle colonies because of the abundant forests, and Pennsylvania was moderately successful in the textile and iron industries. Mostly, the middle colonies are going to be known for exporting cereal crops like rice, wheat, corn, oats, sorghum, rye, and millet. And I mean, basically crops you can eat. That's what the middle colonies did. New York started as New Netherlands. This was a Dutch colony in 1609. James, the Duke of York, was given it from Charles II. The English took over in 1664 and renamed it New York. This was a middle colony, or a breadbasket colony. Then Pennsylvania, this is one that individually you do need to know a little bit better. In 1681, William Penn was granted a charter for land between Maryland and New York. King Charles was in debt to Penn's father. Penn was a Quaker and he gave the people two rights: freedom of religion and the right to elect public officials. So they tried very hard to negotiate fair treaties with natives. And Pennsylvania, because it's built from Quakers, tends to be the most religiously tolerant colony. Now, Delaware, 1682, the Duke of York grants William Penn this land. It becomes a colony in 1704. It's a middle colony. Delaware's not super important, but you know it. New Jersey, the Duke of York splits this land in half for two friends, East Jersey and West Jersey. The government quarrels caused them to be combined in 1702, and this is a middle colony. Then the southern colonies. You've already met Virginia and Maryland. The colonies of the southern Atlantic coast and the British West Indies used long growing seasons to develop plantation economies based on exporting staple crops. They depended on the labor of enslaved Africans, who often constituted the majority of the population in these areas, especially as time goes on, and developed their own forms of cultural and religious autonomy. North Carolina is founded in 1663 by English nobles. The charter was granted by Charles II. Charleston was the main city that was named after Charles II and became a very important port city. Bad politics forced a split of the colony into North and South. South Carolina is founded in 1663. In 1729, South Carolina receives its name after a political dispute and becomes a colony. It had large plantations for growing crops and raising livestock. Georgia becomes a colony in 1733. James Oglethorpe was granted a charter to start Georgia for the poor and unfortunate who leave prison. It was known as a buffer zone between the Spanish and the English colonies. So, important to know, in general, New England, Puritans settled in families, longer life expectancy, better climate, less disease, not as long growing season, tended to be a little bit more rocky and dry, or a little bit more rocky and not quite as arid up there. Merchants and artisans, subsistence farming. Middle colonies were the breadbasket. They grew a lot of cereal crops there, but also they did a lot of trade in cities like New York and Philadelphia. Chesapeake, Virginia and Maryland, tobacco farming, but also trade on the coast. Southern colonies were more plantation based, labor intensive crops like rice, indigo, and cotton. A small number of elite plantation owners and majority small farmers. But remember, in all of this, distance in Britain's initially lax attention led to the colonies creating self-governing institutions that were unusually democratic for the areas. They kind of are able to see after themselves. The New England colonies based power in participatory town meetings, which in turn elected members to their colonial legislatures. The southern colonies, elite planters exercised local authority and also dominated the elected assemblies. This was all possible because of something called salutary neglect. This was an unwritten, unofficial policy of the British government in practice from about the late 1600s to the mid 1700s that allowed its North American colonies to be largely left on their own with little British interference. Britain, though, is going to come to see the Americas as a cash cow and a source of income with almost unlimited natural resources for Britain to participate in colonial stuff around the world. By the early 1700s, the British will be sending more and more officials to keep an eye on things and restrict trade, and the colonists aren't going to like that too much. But we'll get to that next time.